Yeah, and I just realized that based on when this episode is going to drop, it's going to be the one right after we talked about Alien 3, and I went on my whole like tirade about how the Alien movies are Beowulf, but in a sci-fi setting. So I realize listeners might be very tired of me talking about it at this point. But you know what? We're going to talk about it for this episode because we're talking about the 13th Warrior, which is directly supposed to be Beowulf.
Yeah.
So I'm sorry, guys. Like, we're talking about Beowulf again.
Welcome to Certain Point of View's Another Pass podcast. Be sure to subscribe, rate, and review on iTunes. Just go to certainpov.com.
Hey everyone, and welcome back to Another Pass podcast. I'm Case Aiken, and as always, I am joined by my co-host, Sam Alisea.
Hi.
And today we are talking about a critical panned movie, a box office bomb, but a cult classic that I love a lot. Today we are talking...
I love this movie too.
Oh, yeah. Today we are talking about the 13th Warrior. And to have that conversation, I could not think of a better guest than Jeremy DeAngelo.
Hello.
Jeremy, this episode actually is happening because you and I were just chatting on Facebook because we went to college together. We used to do theater together. I attended the defense of your thesis, which was on Norse mythology and specifically Loki.
Oh my goodness. I must have blanked that out because I was so tense and nervous. I forgot that you were there, Case.
Somewhere buried in my documents, I have a copy of it because you sent it over to me because I was like, that sounds dope. Because I actually hadn't read it before I went, because you just were like, hey, I'm talking about Loki. I'm like, yes, I love to talk about Loki.
Yeah, that was before everyone knew Loki.
Right. Yes.
And so those of us who actually knew what that name was, was very few and far between.
Yeah, he had not dominated Tumblr at that point.
Yeah. He's got that Tumblr money now.
But specifically, we had done an episode a little while ago on Beowulf, the Neil Gaiman scripted CGI movie that came out in the mid-2000s. And, you know, it was a great episode. I had a really fun time talking to Ben about it. But, you know, it deserved to be on this show. And we were talking about like, hey, you know, it'd be fun to like do another like Beowulf movie because you've got a layer of expertise and it's just fun to talk to you about that kind of literature. And I was like, you know what? The 13th Warrior, critics hated it. I love it, but let's talk about it. I'm sure there's something to talk about.
Absolutely.
And whoa, when I did some research, is there a lot to talk about? But why don't you give like just some basic credentials? Like who are you? Why should people listen to you?
Yeah. So after Case and I went to college, I went on to graduate school specifically for medieval studies. And as you kind of pointed out, Case, my particular interest is kind of in Northern Europe. And so my degree is in medieval studies, but I specifically study Old English, Old Norse, Old Irish literature. And I got my PhD in 2013. And so I've been teaching as a professor at various places ever since then.
Yeah, so it's fair to say that you are, academically speaking, the most qualified person we've ever had on an episode to talk about the specific topic of that episode.
Yeah, although I found that doesn't necessarily make me fun at parties. So
that's fair, but I feel like this movie definitely needs someone like you to talk about it.
Maybe so. You eventually learn that, you know, people don't necessarily want you to tell them everything that's wrong.
I want you to tell me everything that's wrong. I'm here for it. I enjoy this movie, and I think that honestly, I liked it when I saw it when I was a lot younger, and I enjoy it for what it is. But I think we can all agree that there is a lot of things that, like, there was not someone sitting here that on this, you know, on the set that was really like, I wouldn't know, because it wasn't for either culture, whether it be the Arab or the Norse culture. I just feel like there's a lot of missed opportunities. And honestly, this film might have been okay if it was just like two like space cultures, like if it had been like another planet where there was like lightly based on these cultures.
Maybe so. I assume Michael Crichton filled that role. It was his book. He always did research for the books, and so I could see everyone else saying, "Well, why do we need anyone other than Michael?"
Yeah,
right. Well, I would argue that Michael Crichton's role in this movie was probably too big. especially based on later stuff with it. So, like I said, I also really like this movie. It is a cult classic, and I think that it holds up really well if viewed from a very specific lens. But it was a huge bomb at the time. Critics hated it at the time. And I assumed that, like, because I've seen a lot of like support on the internet, that opinion had overall changed. And then when I went looking into it, a lot of critics that I like currently also really don't like this movie. And I was like, oh, wow. Oh, God, what's going on here? And then I started doing some digging and I was like, oh, I see what's going on here. Because this is a John McTiernan film in a certain sense. And that's interesting for us because we, at this point, have now talked about John McTiernan twice on this show, but only in the capacity of fifth movies, where we talk about movies that had adversity and where the creative efforts of the people involved in making the film turned it around and did what we talk about on Another Pass normally, like where the movie got another pass, because we talked about it for Die Hard and we talked about it for Predator. But this is not one of those. This is a regular episode. And this movie, John McTiernan technically directed, but in a lot of very real ways, it was Michael Crichton who was the director of this movie, especially for the final cut of the movie. Apparently, when they went into reshoots, Crichton and McTiernan were both shooting the same scenes, and Crichton said, "It doesn't matter, I have final cut," and had complete control over how the ultimate movie was shaped.
That's insane, honestly.
But it's not out of this world to think about, because remember, we talked about Congo a few weeks back. Months back. Time is a lake that is impossible to care about.
It has no meaning.
Yeah, time occurred. We talked about Congo and how, it's really interesting how they deviated from the books and made it sort of like a fun pulp fiction-y kind of romp, and that it had been stalled in production for a long time because Michael Crichton was very specific about what he wanted for the adaptation. This book was written in the 70s and also took a long time to make it to screen. And once it was actually shot and cut, and they gave a test screening in 1997 for a 1998 release, it was terribly received, and they had to reshoot a ton of stuff. And that's why it ended up actually coming out after The Mask of Zorro and in 1999. So there's a troubled production history. And if they had pulled it off, this would have been a great candidate for a fifth movie. As it is good and beloved, but there are faults, and once you start seeing them, you're like, they exist. So, Jeremy, what's your relationship with this movie? Like, Sam mentioned she saw it and like loved it. I saw it I actually was introduced to it in a high school English class my senior year, so this was 2000.
Oh, that's interesting.
2002, and fell in love with it then, and have sung its praises ever since. But what's your association with this movie?
Yeah, I didn't see it until graduate school, actually. Medievalists often like to bewail the lack of what we consider any good adaptation of the story of Beowulf. And so it's something that you'll hear at cocktail parties all the time. Oh, there's no good Beowulf movie. But that's usually accompanied then by the caveat, except for the 13th Warrior. There's something to be said for the 13th Warrior. And so, everyone kind of begrudgingly, I guess I should say those in the know, kind of begrudgingly kind of nod to the 13th Warrior. And I was like, well, I've heard of this movie, but I've never seen it. So I guess I should take a look at it. So I watched it maybe 10, 15 years ago for the first time. And it was interesting revisiting it because my recollection of the film before I saw it again was that I kind of thought the film was done, but then all of a sudden there was far more to it than I expected plot-wise. And suddenly I think I maybe lost the thread at some point because I just remember being confounded as to why they were suddenly running around underground and getting very confused about the ending. I was able, upon rewatching it, I was able to follow it a bit more closely this time. But my initial response to it was, well, that was interesting, which is actually high praise. I was like, it certainly wasn't boring. But it went in directions that I wasn't prepared for when I first saw it.
Yeah. I mean, Antonio Banderas, this is probably like his best movie next to Spy Kids. And I say that in all seriousness.
That's some shots fired at Mask of Zorro.
It's okay. But I think the order is Spy Kids, 13th Warrior, Mask of Zorro. That's what I think. You don't agree? I haven't seen Mask and Zara in a really long time, but I don't remember enjoying it as much as I enjoyed this
Ooh.
film.
We don't need to litigate Mask of Zara right now. I like that movie, and it came out at about the same time, so it was on my mind.
I was like, are we having a war now?
It's funny. It's been a very long time since I've seen Mask of Zorro, but maybe about a year ago, one of the film critics at New York Magazine brought that movie up as like an underappreciated gem. So at least in case there are some people that would agree with you.
I'm still putting it in his top 3.
I'm not even going to bring up Puss in Boots.
Fair enough. Oh, now I don't know. I'm going to have to watch Mask of Zara and get back to you guys.
Yeah, but Jeremy, you brought up the specific thing that we haven't really described. For those who don't know about this movie, it is an Antonio Banderas-led, John McTiernan technically directed movie that is supposed to be a deconstruction of the Beowulf myth. Or legend, whatever you want to describe it as.
Yeah.
It is taking all of the events of Beowulf roughly and trying to create a realistic framework for them to transpire under. And for the most part, it's fairly one-to-one, with one big caveat, which is that in addition to the time passage of Beowulf, that this all takes place over a relatively short amount of time.
Yeah.
They encounter the quote-unquote fire verm, the dragon, earlier in the narrative, and then have sort of a second round against it at the very end of the movie, which caught me off guard at first too, because it's like, oh, well, if you know the Beowulf saga, it's like, okay, you fight Grendel, then you fight the mother, and then you fight the dragon.
Yeah.
And like in that sequence. And so it's like, oh, they fought, like up until like the first encounter with the Wendol, the equivalent of Grendel in this, like is a pretty like, okay, yeah, here's a realistic depiction of like something kind of similar-ish that maps pretty one-to-one. And then it's like, oh, and now they're fighting the dragon. What? Holy shit. That got big. Oh, and now they're going to go fight the mother. Oh, that's weird. Oh, they're fighting the dragon again. Okay.
Yeah. If you're going with the actual order of the story, it takes a lot of time to get there, but then suddenly everything that happens in Beowulf is seemingly happening all at once.
Yeah, and I just realized that based on when this episode is going to drop, it's going to be the one right after we talked about Alien 3, and I went on my whole like tirade about how the Alien movies are Beowulf, but in a sci-fi setting. So I realize listeners might be very tired of me talking about it at this point. But you know what? We're going to talk about it for this episode because we're talking about the 13th Warrior, which is directly supposed to be Beowulf.
Yeah.
So I'm sorry, guys. Like we're talking about Beowulf again. Fourth time this season.
Well, yeah. We're recording this around the Christmas season, and the Grinch is another Beowulf narrative to a certain degree. You have a home invader who is upset with all of the noise that he hears coming from the town, and so he invades and attacks it. And so really, Case, you're just seeing Beowulf everywhere because he is everywhere.
Oh my God, you're breaking my brain with that one. I'm like, I can't dispute that one. It actually makes sense.
Yeah, absolutely.
God damn it.
Listen, the Who's in Whoville just like singing songs, okay?
Yeah.
The Who's and the Hrothgars and Hrothgarsville. Yeah. So, Jeremy, with this rewatch, where did you fall on that one? Like, were you more positive, negative? Like, what's your stance on this movie ultimately?
I mean, I don't think I necessarily have. I don't think I necessarily have high standards, or at least I wasn't approaching it with high standards. I once heard somebody describe a hipster as somebody who watches bad movies for intellectual reasons, and I'm definitely that. So like as I said before, I was just like, ooh, this is interesting. I really don't necessarily care. So it met my expectations, I guess I should say. I think that they were doing something really interesting with it, and that in and of itself, I think, is kind of a worthy endeavor. And so I like that they went there. I don't necessarily agree with all of the things that they did. But at least it was, at least it was them trying to do something with it instead of just kind of giving a flat adaptation of the source material.
Yeah. Next week, when we're talking about the Christopher Lambert-led sci-fi Beowulf movie, we'll see how that comes across, because we're just doing Beowulf, guys. This is just a Beowulf show now, guys.
Oh my gosh. I will say things that definitely worked in this film is the dynamic from the 13 warriors that go on. It's something that worked well in Aliens, which we've talked about also, in terms of like the team, the squad, right? They definitely there's like good moments. There's fun moments. There's ways to make you care. Do you care about every single one of them? Maybe not, but they try their best to try to give everyone like kind of a moment, so you kind of have a moment to do it. And I also like the scene where there's passage of time and he's listening and picking up the language. I thought that was really well done. So things that really worked well.
You know what? That's a great one to mention because like that's always in my notes. I love that scene. I realize that it is heavily edited from the original version. Apparently, the test screening was about 27 minutes longer than the movie that we got. And then they either reshot or rebuilt the ending completely because they wanted that sort of square off between Beowulf, the Beowulf XP in this, with the quote unquote leader of the Wendol. Like that sequence wasn't there. So like I don't know if they didn't fight some kind of equivalent of the Wendol, which because that's in the book, like the end part of that fight. But
right,
it definitely was totally reshot. However it was.
Okay.
And then a lot of stuff that happens earlier is trimmed down substantially. And if you look at that montage, which I rather like, you can see that they were definitely parts of scenes that like we're not getting. Like there's a lot of travel stuff where I'm like, that's a lot of setup, and we don't. You know, you probably would have had like a few more shots in there about like where they are in the world to sort of convey it. And it's like very much trimmed down. That I love it, but it is also very fast. And I am curious if the original version of it had it be a little bit more prolonged so that you slowly were integrated into the characters speaking English. Or rather, let me rephrase that, slowly integrated into the character speaking modern English from Old English. But I love the fact that they do it that way. I think that's so cool. Like the language in this movie is actually really cool. That sequence is one of the two big ones for me. There's that. And I do really like it. I think it's really cool where they like are speaking Old English and random words of modern English are being mixed in there, and you slowly get more and more until you get to the point where like Banderas actually responds to one of the characters. And I think that's just fucking fun. And like, sure, if it was like a little more spaced out, probably could have been even cooler. But like, I dig it because like that's my type of nerd. The other part of it is when they are first in the camp of the Northmen, and Omar Sharif is going around trying to talk to them, and he goes up to one and speaks Greek, and they like go and get someone else, and he speaks Greek to that guy, and he's like responds in Latin, and they don't say anything about it to anyone, and then Omar Sharif's character just like continues in Latin and like just knows the language, so they move on, and then they're speaking in Latin.
I'm happy to hear that because I thought they were speaking Latin to each other, but then when I looked it up, it said they were speaking Greek, and I was thinking like, well, I don't know Greek, but I know Latin. It sounds like Latin.
Yeah, that was definitely Latin.
Right. No, it's a subtle joke that they never comment on, which is that he does speak because he's actually speaking Greek for the first couple lines, and then when he's responded to in Latin, that's when they switch to Latin.
Okay.
And it's like such a language joke. Like you have to know what they're. I don't know Greek, but I do know what Greek sounds like, and I picked up like I know Greek words. But I do speak a little bit of Latin, not good Latin, but good enough that I understood what they were saying.
that actually is also accurate to the area. If someone was coming from the Islamic lands, the Western language that they would be the most familiar with would be Greek.
Right.
But Norsemen coming from the West, if they were going to know a Southern European language, it was likely to be Latin.
Right.
And so that actually is quite accurate as to how they essentially try to approach one another and try to figure out what they can actually communicate.
Yeah, 100% the most subtle thing in this movie, and also my favorite thing.
Going back to the other language moment from the movie, I'm very happy to hear the background that you gave to it, because that moment actually kind of frustrates me as it's shot, because as someone who has to pick up languages in his field, I wish it was that easy.
Oh yeah.
You just spend a week with people and then you'd be able to insult them fluently the way that he does then. And so, I actually understand. I think your average audience would not necessarily have the patience to watch somebody learn a language over time. So I don't think it was necessarily the wrong decision for them to do that, but I would have appreciated a much more realistic examination of how it is that he eventually learns to be able to communicate with these 12 men that he's around.
I think if they had done that scene where it was like, I mean, I understand stylistically it looks amazing around the fire, right? Because they're talking every night around the fire. But if they had done it kind of like melding into different scenery, it would have given you a little more like context that like it's always changing. They're always traveling. Like there's passage of time. They kind of just added rain to be like, this is a different night. And I don't know if that was enough change to like really like cement the fact that this is a long journey. Because in the book, it's a long journey. So this is a long journey. This is why he's learned this over time. It's not just a week. You know, they're traveling to this space, and it is a longer journey than just a couple of weeks.
So I've not actually ever read the book. Do the main events of the book actually take place in Denmark, like Beowulf does, or are they in a different place geographically?
I'm pretty sure it's supposed to be Denmark. I read it a while ago. I was looking up. I was trying to refresh myself on it, but I did not have a chance to reread the whole book in the time leading up to this. But yeah, it takes like they travel to Northern Europe. Like it's I think supposed to be Denmark because it's supposed to be like he goes on to write the first tellings of the story that becomes the legend of Beowulf. You know, regardless of if it's perfectly geographically that way, but it's not supposed to be like Russia or something like that. If that's what you're wondering.
Yeah.
Now I will say, like with that whole like the picking up the language sequence, regardless of how it is, like it is movie magic. You know, like we couldn't have the characters speaking a completely foreign language throughout the whole movie. Regardless, you know, in the book specifically, he, for one thing, he leans on Herger, his friend, like the
Norse
nice
translator.
Yeah. He leans on him a lot more during the whole trip. He has his own translator travel with him actually as well. And it's only really by the end of the book that he is able to freely speak with everyone. But, you know, there's no way to really convey that in a movie. Yeah. Like for one thing, they decide like, all right, we're going to have them all be speaking English, period. Like a language that just didn't exist. Like it would be impossible. And nothing can be really Passion of the Christ unless you have some very weird interests making that movie
and very dedicated audiences.
Correct. Yeah. Yes. So it's a compromise that I'm fairly comfortable with. But, you know, like your statement is valid. And there's plenty of critics who find that the most comical scene in the movie. So like it's a difficult thing to make work precisely. And I do think that probably if it was spaced out more and you had like different campfires while they're traveling, that would have been more effective. But the whole front end of the movie is truncated. Like you can tell from the way that it opens and then it goes into a flat, like it opens in media res for them traveling. It goes to a flashback and it's, you know, if you're looking at it, that's a lot of footage to shoot if you're not going to actually use those scenes.
I was thinking that they have an entire caravan, which could not have been cheap or easy. And it really is just for a few scenes.
Yeah. And one of the biggest actors in the movie, Omar Sharif, is only used in this opening chunk of the movie. And you know, like what's up with that? Clearly what it is that they extended the time in Denmark and compressed the time in the sort of Arabian world that it's set in. And that goes along with some other stuff that like I found out when I looked into what was done. Like there's no chance that they're ever going to release the director's cut. Yeah. Or at least the chance is very small. But McTiernan said that the whole musical score, which they threw out and rewrote, was originally supposed to be much more like Arabic in nature, because like the viewpoint character is supposed to be Ahmed, like it's supposed to be Antonio Banderas' character, and thus all the music sort of is supposed to correspond to that. His viewpoint is always supposed to be the one that we share, and that everything about the Northmen is supposed to be alien, and that he comes to appreciate them. The decision to sort of rewrite the score and to like refocus the lens, as it were, more towards just like a general action stuff about Vikings is all stuff that Crichton did in post. Like Crichton brought in his own musicians. He brought in Jerry Goldsmith to do the score, and they like redid it with like a Viking kind of aesthetic to it to amplify that part. And I think that all goes along with them really compressing that opening chunk of the movie.
That makes sense.
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, again, I would have been really interested in a movie that, you know, spent more time in the kind of the larger Islamic world and then transitioning to the other. I don't know whether general audiences would, but it's interesting to hear that was the original plan with the film.
Yeah, I found a really good quote about it, which makes this movie feel really strange and like really like an anomaly in the context, which is, so this was Sean Kelly writing on The Escapist. The movie feels a product of 1999 in the saddest way possible. 2 years later, 9/11 put a fairly screeching halt to positive, empathetic portrayals of Muslim civilization. Not long after that, coalition forces began bombing Baghdad in search of weapons of mass destruction that never turned up. Nowadays, Norse culture is interwoven throughout the imagery and anger of the alt-right. It's shocking to realize that there was a time when we were willing to acknowledge the richness of culture of the Islamic world far outstripped that of its European counterparts for much of history. And I think that's a really interesting part there. Like, test audiences didn't like having a quote unquote Muslim protagonist at this time, but they still put that forth in this movie. And it's, there's still that element there, but it was sort of like, well, we can't go too far. But then it's pretty accurate. 2 years later, like, we would all feel very weird about making anything that's like kind of like of that way. And it's shocking to think like this movie couldn't have been made 2 years after that.
I was thinking along those lines as well. Like it was, he's supposed to be our surrogate in the story. And the way that we're supposed to identify with him is based on aspects of medieval Islamic culture that don't get emphasized today nearly as much because of the much more antagonistic relationship we have with the Middle East. And so, nowadays, if the movie was being made, the assumption would probably be that Western audiences would identify far more with the Northern European characters. But at least the idea behind this was that, oh no, this person he's civilized, he's clean, he believes in a single God. He clearly must be the person that a modern audience would identify with. And that just would go out the window 2 years later, as you said.
And I mean, it's not, again, this is not the wokest movie of all time.
Yeah.
Even in its original conception, like so like here, elephant in the room. It's Antonio Banderas playing this character.
Yes.
I mean, I will say he's Spanish. And at this time, the Muslim world was actually in control of Spain. So
that is true.
Which is not true. Yeah.
Yeah, it's not completely wrong. But
I'm Sicilian, and if you came to me and asked me to play an Arabic character, I'm pretty sure I should turn that down.
Yeah, or a Greek character, for example.
Yeah, exactly.
It's like, well, a long time ago they did colonize this area, but that was a long time ago.
just because they were in charge of where my ancestors came from doesn't give me a pass.
Right. It's bad. And his interview is like I watched with him and he's like, well, I guess I am exotic. I have my skin, my language, but like he's clearly uncomfortable with it too. And I think he tries to do a respectful portrayal, but like it is an awkward line to walk. And it is one where I don't think that they were like particularly offensive at this time, but like, God forbid anyone ever do the same shit again.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I feel like, I think that any other will do in an other role is something that we don't do anymore, that we were pretty much okay with in the 90s.
So it sounds as if there's a different story to it, but I assume that the reason Omar Sharif wasn't in most of the movie was that they maybe could only get him for a few days, or maybe he couldn't do the more physical aspects of it. But I was thinking that, also he was maybe a get for the movie to kind of give them more authority,
more credibility.
Both as, as a symbol of old Hollywood, but also because he is himself, he would be somebody from from that part of the world being asked to play somebody from that part of the world. At the same time, I would imagine that Omar Sharif could probably tell all sorts of stories about the ways that Muslims had been depicted, and the way that the assumptions that people made about him and his people throughout all the movies that he made in his life.
Oh God, yes. I mean, I will say that he's definitely not in the majority of the movie just because they couldn't get him for the majority of the movie, and maybe they wanted to like play up the otherness. But we do know that like there is a substantial portion that was trimmed down of this like opening part where they're traveling in the Arabic world, and Antonio Banderas' character is supposed to be more of our viewpoint thing. So, like he was never supposed to be huge, but he's definitely reduced to a much smaller role, and apparently quit acting for a few years after this because he was so embarrassed at the final product.
Oh, really? That's a shame.
sad.
But I mean, he might have seen it as progress. I mean, when he was in Lawrence of Arabia, he was acting beside Alec Guinness, who was supposed to be a Saudi in that movie. So he's probably looking at Antonio Banderas and going, "Well, at least he's Spanish."
He might have some like ancestry DNA kind of.
We're getting closer.
But I don't know. I feel like if this movie was made today, that would be definitely outrage. I do think that he did a good job in the role. I don't have a big problem with him. I just think that like there's clearly not any Muslim voices on set, and I think that becomes a little dangerous when that's supposed to be our focal point, right? We're supposed to be seeing the Norsemen through this storyteller's eyes, and even if it's sympathetic to them, I don't know. I feel like I think that that's a misstep, just make those decisions.
Well, particularly because it's a real person. Like Ahmed Ibn Fadlan is an actual Arabic historian and ambassador. Like he was picked to be a viewpoint character by Crichton specifically because he was writing chronicles of his travels. And like the book, The Eaters of the Dead, is presented as, this was a lost manuscript of one of his journeys.
Yeah, and so he was a ambassador who was sent north because there were several tribes in the north who had just recently converted to Islam, and so he was essentially strengthening ties between them and Baghdad. But while there, he encountered Norsemen who were known as the Rus in that area. This is ultimately where the nation of Russia comes from.
Right.
And his account is really is one of the only accounts that we have from the actual time period of what these people were like. And so, ethnographically, it's a really important text to survive. And it's one that Michael Crichton made use of to kind of combine that with Beowulf to tell an epic story. Probably your average theater goer has no idea that it's a historical figure who's being portrayed here. But yeah, he was a real guy.
And it's such a cool thing if you know, but at the same time, it also makes like the casting of Antonio Banderas like just that much a little bit worse. And it's rough. Like it's rough. Like, again, if this was happening today, it would be there would be so much outrage. But we recently talked about Star Trek II, The Wrath of Khan. And a while ago, we talked about Star Trek Into Darkness and how, like, it's really bad to cast an Englishman as an Indian. It's slightly less bad in the 60s to cast a Hispanic actor as one, but at least it's brown. But like, yeah, none of that should be happening now. But clearly Hollywood doesn't learn its lessons sometimes.
Yeah.
I guess, I immediately thought of Exodus, Gods and Kings, which I think came out roughly around the same time as the Star Trek reboots. But similarly, people were upset about English and American actors portraying Egyptians.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah.
Ugh.
We don't learn our lesson.
Nope.
Yay.
We really don't.
You know what I really didn't like, and this has nothing to do with casting or anything like that. On the boat, the bright flashes. I know this is meant to disorient me, but I am motion sick, and I did not enjoy that. I get motion sick just in a car, like I'm the worst, and just the bright flashes in my room. Not a fan of it, and I know it was a stylistic thing, but just want to put that out there. Did not like it. I get that he's on a boat.
It got you to sympathize with Antonio Banderas' character, though. He was feeling much the same way.
He was, and neither of us enjoyed it.
It's a real multimedia experience. We're trying to get you to be experiencing seasickness while we're doing a movie about a character who's seasick.
Exactly. I mean, I guess it did what it's supposed to do, but I hated it. So
imagine if it was like the other Beowulf movie and it was meant to be in 3D.
Oh my God.
Sam, it's good that you bring up the boat, because this is a good segue into one of the real gripes I have with this movie that can be overlooked somewhat if you've watched the movie a shitload of times, but is less okay at a time where, like, who has the attention span to watch the thing more than once, which is the characters, the actual party of 12 that Antonio Banderas is the 13th member of. So by the end of the movie, you have a pretty good idea of a fair amount of them. And you get this whole sequence where they're all like sort of saying like, oh yeah, I'll join. So you at least like get like coverage of each of them. But a lot of them are not really characters. They're they're just part of the party. They're cannon fodder to a certain extent. And while I was watching interviews on this movie, Vladimir Kulich, the actor who played Beowulf, was talking about how he was really trying to get McTiernan just to take like a handheld camera, and while they're on the boat, just get moments of each of them kind of talking, and like maybe sort of you could use that to like add characterization to it, because McTiernan's typically pretty good at getting you to care about the characters. Like, one of the strengths of Die Hard is that the party of thieves that breaks in, every single one of them has a pretty clear personality. You don't necessarily catch all their names. They're the bad guys anyway, but they all have a very clear personality. They all have like gimmicks for what they're doing. Like, you have a clear idea of their job. In this movie, some of them do, but not a lot of them. Like, there was one that I noticed on this watch that I had never paid attention to before. I was like, oh shit, I never saw that guy before. How? And then he was there. Like, he was just in the rest of the movie, but it was like Mr. Poopy Butthole from Rick and Morty. It was like, oh yeah, there's just a new character there. Okay. Like,
I feel like at least some of them, they tried to give them a visual. Like, there was one that had a tattoo that went across his eyes. And so, there was like, okay, it's tattoo. There's tattoo guy.
Except he looks so much like Tony Curran, another guy in the party. It's just the tattoo is the only difference.
Oh yeah.
And I forget the actor's name, but the Blackfish from Game of Thrones, the same actor.
Yeah.
He wears a ridiculous helmet throughout. And so I was always able to tell that it was him.
Yeah.
But some of them didn't even have the benefit of that.
Yeah, there was like one guy with red hair. So, that differentiated him.
Well, you say that, but there's two guys with red hair with very similar beards. But one had a tattoo.
One of them is Tony Kern, and the other guy is the guy with the tattoo.
Right.
There's one guy with red hair. You guys are wrong.
No, they're so similar. I actually had to double check.
But then there's a moment in the movie though where they point out another character with red hair and tell one character to go and fight him.
Yes,
yeah.
It's crazy, and it kind of sucks. Like, at the end of the movie, they actually have descriptions for each of the characters, like in parentheses after their names. So like Dennis Storhey, who plays Herger, who is the cool one, the translator. It's Herger the Joyous. And then Tony Curran, for example, is Weath the Musician. I'm going to note that when I say the musician, if you're like, when did he play music? He doesn't. Like, they don't have that scene. All of these characters, aside from the ones that are like really like obvious, like Misha Hauserman is Rethel the Archer. Like, okay, yeah, that's the guy who's always like using a bow. Like, that part's clear, but they don't really do much with this. Clive Russell, who that's Blackfish, right?
Yeah, that's Black. Yeah.
Yeah, he's called the Fat. He's not that fucking fat. Like, he's not fat.
Yeah, I mean, now it was quite common among the Norse people to give nicknames like that to one another. The problem is that they were oftentimes ironic, and so somebody who's called the Fat might be called that because he's stick thin, potentially. But it's not as if the movie gives us any way to like appreciate or understand that. And besides, they don't use any of those titles in the film, do they?
If they do, it's only in the Old English sections.
Okay.
That's the problem. We don't actually get a lot of characterization for them, particularly once they are speaking a language that we, the audience, understands, which is kind of a bummer. And then there's a weird one. Daniel Southern, who is Edco the Silent, which is their scout, their ranger, who stands out a lot.
Yeah.
He's called the Silent. He actually probably talks more than almost anyone else in the party aside from Herger. Like, he probably talks more than Beowulf. I looked him up because I was like, oh, he stands out a lot. Like, he's a 2-weapon fighting ranger who is really dope and like very skilled at what he does, is able to smell perfume on the winds, is like, oh, I can tell by the horse foot, the hoof fall of that horse that the person is well fed. Like, classic ranger kind of thing. Like, he's dressed. It's great. He has done nothing. He that year was in 4 movies, and as far as I can tell, outside of that, he's a rugby player.
Okay,
and that's it. Like, he like that year he did a couple movies, and that was his entire career. And I'm like, that's weird, because he has like a pretty distinct voice and I like a good look, and I was like, oh yeah, I'm curious what else he's been in. Oh, nothing. Okay,
I guess rugby was his calling.
Yeah.
For the longest time I was trying to figure out which one he was of them, and one of the other ones that I was never able to kind of identify apparently played Lurch in the Addams Family, And so for the longest time, I thought he was that guy because he's big and he has a really long face. But then that character died and he was still around. And so I was like, oh, okay, so I've got this all wrong. I have to just scramble all of the faces and names that I thought I had right. So yeah, they do a very bad job in general with differentiating the various warriors. Even the one that's very distinctive, I got wrong.
Yeah, that's a big bummer of this piece because like the idea of having a set of 13 men who are going on this adventure into a very dangerous situation, like each person who dies should feel like a big consequence. You know, like there's a bit when they fight Angus, and we'll talk about that scene next because might as well. But when there's the fight with Angus and it's like, we'll miss his sword tonight. Like that's a big thing in the book. Like they talk about like, it really sucks right now. We're really like scraping by on the guys that we have. Like to have a big young dude dead is a huge consequence to their like ability to defend themselves. And like, we should really feel that for the main 13. And like, it is a giant bummer. Like there was a suggestion that Vladimir Kulich made when he was like talking about like, oh, you could have these like little moments. Like if one was a blacksmith, how cool would that have been if he was the blacksmith that helped Antonio Banderas make his scimitar?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
As impossible and implausible as that sequence is. Like I'm going to admit that's not how metalworking works. but at least you could have a blacksmith outside of just your random ambassador being like, no, I'm telling you, this is how you make a sword that I can use. Mm-hmm. Like it could have at least had some like emotional connection with a character who maybe isn't like one of the main foreground characters, you know? Like I love Herger. I think he's such a cool character. I didn't know his name until I was like looking up the list for this episode. Like I had no idea. I've seen this movie so many times and always been like, that guy, I like that guy. He's a good guy.
Like, I didn't know his name at all until you just said it. Yeah. Like that's how long and I've watched this movie before, never picked up on his name at all.
Yeah. And like, we are all like, oh yeah, he's a good guy. Like he's the translator. He's cool. He's really nice. Like he's a little gross. He like sneezes into the water and then gives it to Antonio Banderas to like wash his face. But
I have something to say about that moment once you're finished with your point.
But I was just going to say he's so amicable. It's amazing that I had no idea what his name is. And that is a weakness of this movie.
Yeah, absolutely.
Go.
So that moment is directly from Ibn Fadlan's account of the Rus. One of the things that Ibn Fadlan in his account cannot believe is how dirty these people are. And he describes in long detail about how they have just a basin of water and they do all their disgusting toiletries in it and then just pass it on to the next person. And he, as a Muslim who has very strict rules about how he's supposed to wash himself and cleanse himself, is completely disgusted by these people. And that is like the one specific detail, I guess, that came from Ibn Fadlan's account, made its way into Eaters of the Dead, made its way into the screenplay, and then survived the editing process to be retained in the movie directly from a medieval voice.
Yeah. And it works really well. Like that sequence, you know, like in the book, it's like slave girls bring the water and then they bring it to the next person. Mm-hmm. You know, like them just passing a bowl around works really well. Like I think there's good economy of storytelling there to convey, yeah, he's really grossed out by these people in that moment. Like, yeah, if you were a screenwriter adapting this, you'd be crazy not to have that scene.
I guess, but they also, the other thing, and the thing that Ibn Fadlan's account is almost always cited for, is his discussion of their practice of human sacrifice. And, if you're looking for something to catch people's attention, you would imagine that would perhaps have made it into there. But that maybe it would have made them too frightening for audiences.
It's there, but it's actually a reshoot.
Oh, okay.
So when they're at the camp, that part is a reshoot right there, where they have the so the woman that they actually sacrifice for the old king before Beowulf assumes command, the woman is actually Dennis Storhei's wife, so Herger's wife in the real world. So that's why they were able to get her for the reshoots specifically. But that was something that Crichton did to like bring that back in, and that's actually why like one of the things that we can tell was Crichton versus McTiernan, because I love the way they use the "Lo there, do I see my father" stuff. It's always been a scene that I've been like, that's a badass way to like set up like go into a fight sequence, yada yada yada. And they have that scene earlier, but those are the only two times where they have it. That's Crichton reshoots to try to get that in there as a through line so that we have it for the end of the movie.
Okay, I'm sorry, I must have missed the the sacrifice. I know they had the funeral, but I must have missed the sacrifice.
Yeah, they don't focus on it.
Yeah, it's far into the distance.
Yeah, there's a woman that they put on the boat and then they set it on fire. They don't have any of the like ritual, like we're all gonna have sex with her to pass on our good word to her lover in the afterlife stuff, or any of the other weird shit.
Yeah, it's basically, and he even says, he's like, this is the old way. You're not going to see this again. As if they've like, they're going to move on from it. And I was just like, well, no, well, how do you know you're not going to see this again? Like, wait, what is this changing of the guard of this era? I don't understand. Is it because your king is poor? Can't afford a sacrifice. I wasn't sure about that. But
that's interesting.
It's very far in the distance. And the focus is really the two of them, the translator and Antonio Banderas, sitting there staring into the distance as like she's basically giving the speech, and then she's lifted on, and then you just see the boat on fire, and it's just said that she's there. So it's not really the focus on it, which I think is very interesting, because I do feel that, like, I mean, things have been leveled at Crichton before about his kind of, I'm not going to pussyfoot around racism. And I think that there is this feeling of like, oh no, they're moving on from that kind of thing. And oh yeah, it was something that was done, but you know, it's fine. And I think that like, there's this feeling often that like human sacrifice is something that savages do, even though almost every culture has had some form of sacrifice. I mean, you can even say the executions in a way are a form of sacrifice. So yeah, it's just one of those things that it's just, I was like, oh, are we just kind of, we're just kind of cleaning this up? What, like, I was like, it wouldn't, like, did they murder her first? Did they just put her on the boat and light her on fire? Death by fire is really terrible.
Yeah, it's real bad.
Yeah, I mean, it's really kind of an attempt to kind of whitewash these characters and their history. You know, by making the human sacrifice, only a minor part of what it is that you're seeing. It makes it so it's not central to their identity. But something that is not made clear in the film at all, but that you can see in Ibn Fadlan's account, and really is just the historical fact of the era, is that most of the commerce that was going on in this area was slaves. All of the people who were being abducted by the Vikings in Western and Northern Europe were sent to this region to be sold as slaves in the Islamic world. And that was the general commerce that was going on. That's why these people were in contact with one another. To suffice it to say, if you were to make your main characters slave traders, it probably would have backfired if you were trying to make us feel bad about them being killed off one by one.
Yeah, probably.
Yeah, it's a really interesting juxtaposition when you look at then the Northmen in contrast with Ibn Fadlan, and then in contrast with the Wendol, which I want to get to, but I did say we should talk about the Angus fight real quick, and I want to mention that one because I actually really like that scene. Like the fight with Angus. So Herger is told to pick a fight with him and does so, and they make it very clear, like, he is younger and stronger. Like, he is going to, like, in a fair fight, is going to win. And it's like looking that way. And then all of a sudden it's revealed that Herger's just that much better. Like, he's such a trained warrior in the situation that he's able to instantly end the fight. Fatally, a human sacrifice in this situation. And I think that scene itself is a really cool, I like the duel. I don't know the logistics of like the breaking the shields stuff and the fight to the death part of it all. But I do like the scene itself and how it works, and then setting up how it is their counterfight to the intrigue, the stuff that's going on behind the scenes. But it also is a thing that points out a thing that really sucks, which is that whole plot thread stops right there.
I was wondering if there was more that had been left on the cutting room floor.
Yeah, they cut out this whole thing.
I was half expecting it to be revealed at the very end that the king's son had allied with the Wendol.
It feels like it, right?
Yeah. He's just so hostile to them. He's clearly meant to be the Unferth character.
Right. It's weird that they call him Wiglaf, but he's Unferth in terms of his role.
Yeah, and so they set him up to be kind of like the human antagonist in the story. But then you're right. After that fight, he basically he basically learns his lesson. Then I suppose, and then he doesn't figure into any of the rest of it.
Yeah, he's not even like in the throne room at the moment that they come back from killing the mother. And I would assume that he would be there and be like, oh, good, that guy's dying. Okay, cool. Like, at least that would have been like something, like just been like, oh, okay, cool. But he's not even there. Like, it's like he like ran away.
Yeah, but again, the entirety of that last part of the movie is reshoots, and clearly they had cut that plot. It's a bummer because like it's a thing that's going on. Like one of the complaints about this movie, and honestly, one of the complaints about Beowulf is that it is a very straightforward monster shows up, we fight that monster. Next monster shows up, we fight that monster. Biggest monster shows up, we fight that monster. We die doing it because we're that devoted to doing good. Like that's the complaint. And in fact, the book was first written as sort of a bet of like Beowulf is inherently boring. And Crichton was trying to counter that by being like, well, what if you look at it from a different perspective and do this kind of deconstruction? And I think it's fair to say, like, you need to do something to make it more interesting than just monster fight, monster fight, monster fight, because it's that part of it is very straightforward. And from a film perspective, you want to have audience expectations, wane and then like surge, and then you want to have like twists in there, and you can't have a twist if it's just like, yep, there's a monster, we fought it, okay, moving on. Like you have to have some kind of reveal, you have to have like some kind of changing of the stakes. Like nothing really is like once they show up and the Wendol is the threat, the only thing that changes is the establishment of how big of a threat they are, but nothing else really changes in this movie.
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, the way the history of the way that people used to read Beowulf is that at least scholars used to ignore the monsters completely. And all of the tangential parts of the play that people, for the most part, tend to skip over or have their eyes glaze over with regards to it. Linguists and historians were always kind of like combing through there to try to like figure out what the connections were with regards to it. Then a little known medievalist named J.R.R. Tolkien actually suggested that the monsters were maybe important to the narrative. And so the idea that Beowulf is about monster fights is kind of a relatively new idea. The political intrigues and the things that are discussed around the monster fights are quite important, but for an audience watching a movie, that's just not going to work. And so, then you are, as you say, Case, stuck with monsters. And then what is it that you do to make that more interesting? And so the deconstruction route that Crichton takes is the one that he does there.
Yeah. And, like, I'm not going to pretend that I don't love those kind of monster fights. Again, looking at this movie from the lens of, oh, it's Beowulf being deconstructed is why I love this movie, because I'm looking at it for those things. And that's really cool. But, other adaptations, again, I'm going to cite the Alien movies. Like, there's a lot going on there in terms of who is the real terror in this versus who is the wild animal. The aliens themselves are not necessarily a malicious force. They are just something that can never be understood, that will kill you if you interact with it, and that it's best to leave aside. And the true malicious force is capitalism. That is the intrigue of this all. In this movie, the intrigue is there should be like court stuff going on. There should be stuff going on. In the Beowulf text, there's all these allusions to actual historical figures. Those are the reasons why you're reading it. You're like looking for what's it alluding to, what people are connecting to, who knows whom in the scenario. Like, there's the language aspect also, which, is also really fascinating. How are they describing things that we can corroborate based on, that we can identify that what they're saying here is always a fascinating component of that. What is the state of Old English at this point in terms of like its complexity and its ability to convey an idea? Those are all really cool things that you would look at when you're looking at Beowulf. And then the metaphor of these monsters is also important. But if you don't have a metaphor to use with these monsters, that's also a thing.
Yeah, it's like, so in Beowulf, I mean, you can cause all sorts of fights by arguing about what Beowulf is actually about. But a line in Beowulf that is repeated several times throughout the poem is, "That was good kuning," that was a good king. And the stories that are told in between the monster fights are often about good rulers and bad rulers and examples of where they went wrong and what they did right. And when I teach the text, I often ask asked the students, so at the end of the story, is Beowulf a good king? Where does he fit within all of these stories? And so, the monster fights serve, if you're looking at it through that lens, to to give examples of how Beowulf is or is not doing well in leading his people. And so, there's a political element to it. So when you're doing the 13th Warrior and, they are fighting the monsters, including Wiglaf, and, this court intrigue seems to be suggesting a similar type of argument that they're trying to build, but then they just drop it. And so they really ends up not having anything to say on that point.
And then we're left with just the monsters. So why don't we talk about them for a second? Because I'm really interested in the way that they are interpreted here. I think that there are some limitations that the reshoot occurred, but so in the book, first of all, the book is called The Eaters of the Dead. The cannibalism aspect of this all is supposed to be really front and center. When they went into filming, it was still called Eaters of the Dead. It was only a later stage rewrite to change the title to The 13th Warrior in the hopes of making it more marketable. So it's supposed to be about a tribe of cannibals, and specifically it's supposed to be about a tribe of Neanderthals.
I got that from the first time I watched it, but then the second watching, I couldn't tell whether that was something I read into it and it wasn't there. But they are meant to be not Homo sapiens, but Neanderthals.
Yeah, Homo neanderthalensis.
Okay, so I was right the first time.
Now, the text itself is I forget if there's so the book has both the layer of Ahmed's viewpoint and then also the transcribers trying to interpret what he's saying. So obviously, a historical figure from the time is not going to be familiar with the concept of an offshoot of Homo sapien. That's just not in there. But the idea is that they are human, but not quite human. And I think that it's for the most part abandoned in this just by virtue that they have human actors and they can't do too much to make them that different in terms of physicality. Neanderthal man was already pretty close to humanity. They're a little more muscular, they're a little bit squatter, they have a little bit of different brow shape, but they're pretty close. And there's only so much you can do with an actor to make them not look like that.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, so because at least in the the way that they're depicted, Crichton is basically combining all sorts of different qualities from different cultures from all different time periods. They associate themselves with I'm forgetting the technical term, but those ancient statues of the Venus.
Yeah, the Venus of Willendorf.
Yes, the Willendorf Venus, and so though that's from prehistoric history, but they also have elements of bear worship attached to them, which is attached to all sorts of circumpolar tribes that one can find even today. And then there's also the tradition of the berserk that comes from Norse tradition itself. And so he basically just takes all these elements of them and ascribes it to Neanderthals, and to create this kind of this somehow human but also inhuman tribe of people that are attacking the Danes for. Is there an articulated reason why they're fighting them?
Not so much in this.
No.
In Beowulf, it's that he doesn't have a wall, and they do comment that he is undefended, that there's no wall surrounding the fortress. But I don't think the hubris that antagonized Grendel is an aspect of this. I think it's just that it's easy pickings.
Okay, so because they're just supposed to be seen as kind of expansionist in a way. It's not that they're not defending their territory or anything like that.
I mean, I guess it's that he did establish this fortress recently. It's not supposed to be an older base, that he moved into the space and set it up.
Oh,
so maybe
okay.
That's that. I guess that's the antagonizing component there. But I don't know if there's any interactions or anything like that. It's just all of a sudden these people showed up and we eat them. I mean, I think that it is really interesting from the perspective of this is a movie being told from an outsider looking at this other culture who is now dealing with an even more primitive, violent culture.
Yeah.
And I think that that's a really interesting component that is not expounded upon sufficiently for this movie. I think that one of the weaknesses of this movie is a lack of theme. Beyond just being we're doing Beowulf. And I think that would be a really cool thing to sort of expand upon, the interaction of these different cultures, and how the true strength here is that Ahmed ibn Fadlan finds common ground and finds understanding, and these people accept him into their fold. But the Wendol are xenophobic. They do not allow outsiders into their midst. They keep themselves separate, and as a result, are regressive. And I think it's almost even stronger if they are humans who are specifically trying to stay away from civilization. Like, I think that's a more interesting stance than just like, yep, they're Neanderthal, man.
Yeah, I mean, I think the problem with it is that we don't see anything really from their point of view. You know, in they're just simply depicted as other and hostile in the ways that, you know, other ethnicities are so frequently depicted as other and hostile in genres such as Westerns and things like that. You know, I find the ethnic politics at the end of the movie rather icky in this way. You know, just depicting them as unredeemably evil is kind of easy, too easy narratively, I think, especially when they've already done so much to kind of establish that it is possible to bridge cultural differences between, you know, quote unquote civilized and barbarian people at the beginning of it.
Yeah, I mean, it would be disingenuous to have them like come to an understanding, but I don't know. I mean, we don't know what the actual finale was. There is a part of me that wonders, like, was it something like Zulu, where at the end of the movie they're all like, "We respect you, we're going to back off." Which I'm not saying that is the model of racial sensitivity either. It's called Zulu, but it is at least an interesting tact to take. And, you know, instead of it's just like, nope, we're gonna, you know, like the end of this movie, like it's kind of a badass scene, but it is just a bunch of berserkers running with no strategy into a base to all die. Like, that doesn't come across as being a culture that you can reason with, and that's a shame.
Yeah, I mean, but the reason it is because they've just essentially chosen, you know, all of the stereotypical elements of primitives,
yeah,
as a way to make them the bad guys. Like, oh, you know, they paint themselves, they think they're animals, they eat people. You know, they've made them over the top evil. You know, whereas you know, it reinforces, I guess, stereotypes about primitive people that is kind of just too easy. It's similar to how 2 years later they would just simply use shorthands for Muslims to create easy villains in films. I feel like they're doing the same with the Wendol in this.
I think that's fair. I think it's fair to say that they make it too easy. I mean, even the end, right? They learned from this lady in the woods that they have to kill the mother and then kill the guy with the big horns, and then they're in the clear. And like literally that's what happens, right? They kill the mother and then they come back out and they kill the guy with the big horns, and even though everyone's there, they just go home.
Yeah, you know, and you know, similarly, there's no, unlike the other characters, there's no figures on the other side that seem to have their own personalities or wills. They essentially are a hive mind. Once you chop off the head, all the others just pack up and go home.
Yeah, the Oracle being like, you have to kill the leader too. That's such a reshoot right there. But that's why they're like, we have to go kill the mother. Yep. Well, all right, we got to go kill the mother. It's like, oh, by the way, you also have to kill the leader. He wears the horns.
I was assuming he was Grendel.
I know that's I mean, they're using that iconography there, but yeah. So as far as I could tell from the interview I watched with McTiernan, one of the big criticisms was that there was not a real duel at the end, that they wanted to have an actual rival for Beowulf or for Beowulf to fight in the last sequence there. So they established this character, and they got a reshoot where they have this sort of like look of the leader at one point during the fire verm attack earlier in the movie. But that part was added to exacerbate the tension between the characters. Like I said, I vaguely recall something pretty similar in the book, so I'm not sure if it had been cut for the original screenplay and then played up in the reshoots. I don't remember that part, but that is like a note that at least McTiernan cited. On that note, the mother of the Wendol. So I was confused when I was looking into the credits because I was like, holy shit, she was like 70 when they made this movie. And that's because the actor who played the Wendol mother in the sequence that we saw is not the one who's credited in the movie. And that is because they shot the sequence multiple times. And originally they were going to have an older actress who was going to be more full-figured and thus looking like the Venus of Willendorf as a representation there. And it was going to be this kind of darker thing. And that's part of the thing that we haven't talked about yet, which is that the movie shifted genre. So the movie was originally supposed to be a horror movie, and it played up. It has become more of an action epic kind of movie with horror elements. But it's a weird thing because it also was originally supposed to be PG-13, and then they added bloodshot inserts to make it an R-rated movie. But at least when McTiernan went into it, he cites that he really wishes that he had been like told that he was making an R-rated movie, because he would have shot an R-rated movie. And instead of just like adding spots where like, oh, that head got ripped off. Oh, there's a lot of blood over there. Like, that's why like Antonio Banderas walks in and then he like just comes out and vomits. And then they just have inserts of like close up of all the blood. Like it was all stuff that was done after the fact, because they're like, oh, the audience that's going to want to see this is going to want to have the bloody sequences here. And I think that's another thing that's interesting about this movie, where if you take it from the standpoint of Ahmed Ibn Adfalad traveling from what he's familiar with into the space and being beset by various monstrous entities. Like, I have no idea if they had the scene from the book where they're sailing and they get attacked by whales. Like, I have no idea if they ever tried to shoot anything like that. But at the very least, they come and like they deal with the Wendol, and they're scary. Like they go into a cave and like, you know, kind of a semi-climax of the movie is them being chased into the darkness, and like they can only escape by like holding their breath and going into the water below. Like, that's scary. Like, and you could play that up to be really scary instead of having big action scenes. And most of the fights up until that point are all in poorly lit settings. It's perfect for a horror movie. And then the last fight is actually well lit because it's daytime and it's like, oh, it's raining, but it's, you know, there's no fires and it's not crazy camera work. It's a lot of slow-mos. You can clearly see what's going on in a way that no sequence up until that point was, because up until that point, like all the original shooting is still framing it like a horror movie, like Alien.
Yeah.
And I think that that's another thing where it's like, oh, that's weird, because like we hadn't gotten to the point in our culture yet where, you know, a couple years later we get Lord of the Rings and like epic movies became real big. But we're not quite there yet. You know, we hadn't started to develop some of the 20th or the 21st century language for epic movies, and so this movie isn't really using any of those kind of shots. Like, it's not shot like Braveheart. It is shot like a horror movie up until like the end of the movie, where it's a lot more static shots, a lot less less dynamic camera work. And I'm kind of curious, like if that kind of played into the audience not loving it because they didn't know what kind of movie it was supposed to be.
That's interesting. Maybe so. And it didn't occur to me to think of it as a horror movie going into it, but it, you know, I go into it with all sorts of expectations about the classic material. But at the same time, you know, you say that the first section of the movie was meant to be longer. Was that going to be horror inflected?
I think it's a scenario of you have them sort of, here's the calm, and they travel into the terrifying place. But this movie, like, that's all the montage opening the sequence. Like, we're 10 minutes in, you're into like, oh, we're traveling to the north. Okay, cool. If that was a full half hour and you get very calm and comforted by the, like, here's a guy. He is making flirtatious acts with this woman. Oh, that woman's wife doesn't like it, or that woman's husband doesn't like it. Like, that all would have been a different kind of vibe. And then all of a sudden he's thrust into a situation that's much more terrifying and like potentially supernatural. I think that fills more of a horror movie style, but because he starts off so early on in the movie in this sort of setting, it doesn't feel like you have that shift that should accompany a horror movie, where when Michael Myers makes it into town and like actually starts killing people, like there's a good amount of lull before you get to like just the murders. Even Alien, like, it takes a while before the thing bursts out of Kane's chest.
Yeah.
Yeah, there's definitely a build there. I mean, I think now that we're talking about it, that it would have been nice to see more of Antonio Banderas before, because there are moments in, I look as I was rewatching it, I was just like, oh, they're just choosing him as the 13th warrior, but how do they know he can fight? Like, yes, maybe we assume that everyone in this era has some sort of fighting ability. Like, maybe we just make that assumption. But did we know? I was like, we don't really know that. Like, I know that he, like, basically fell in love with a married woman. And so he could be like, I'm a lover, not a fighter. You know, like, I don't know if he's really like, and so we don't really know a lot about him other than he's cast out and kind of sent away because this guy's mad that he fell in love with his wife.
Yeah, I guess it's relatively unclear. And I mean, we really actually know virtually nothing about Ibn Fadlan himself, but they don't really establish, what his place actually is in Baghdad. I mean, if he's a member of the upper classes, he definitely would have known how to fight, at least, but we don't actually know if that's the case.
Yeah, we only get in terms of reference, like anything, right? We got his ability to horse jump, which, clearly you would have to be an experienced horse rider. So you kind of have that, right? Which is actually a good scene because there's a callback later on in the movie where he saves a child with that. And then his insult to the guy at the one of the redheads, because apparently there were two.
I swear there are two.
Supposedly, I don't know. But the insult that he kind of says, he does say that his mom was a pure woman from a noble family. Mm-hmm. So like that's like the only inference that we kind of get. But like if you're not someone who knows medieval history and you're not someone who like there's just, we don't know that he really knows battle. And he's just kind of like, oh, I guess I'm going because I qualify for the no Norseman part.
Yeah, I get, like, you get the impression that he doesn't know how to fight, but then they seem to kind of change the implication halfway through the movie, which is not that he didn't know how to fight, but that he was given the wrong equipment. And then we're back to that scene where he fashions a saber out of the broadsword that he was given. But that doesn't seem to be his objection to it when it's handed to him. His objection seems to be, I don't know how to do this.
Well, his actual line is, I can't lift this.
Yeah, okay. He says it's heavy.
Okay.
But this gets into the anachronisms of this all, which is, so couple of things on this one, like the relative weight differentials for the swords, relatively non-existent. Scimitars didn't exist yet. and talking about the joke they keep making about his horse, where they said only an Arab would bring a dog to war. So in terms of the actual breeding of horses at this point, Arabian stallions were bigger.
I mean, the Norse in general, they had rather small horses. So, yeah, all of that. I mean, if we're talking about the material culture that's depicted in the film, it's all over the place and just a complete mess. So, yeah.
Yeah, and some of that's just movie stuff, the armor pieces being from the wrong eras. There's some that's too early and some that's too late. And the early ones, I'm like, well, they're just, they're holding on to shit as it goes. But whatever, like there's only so much you can do because costuming. I'm sorry, the breastplate wasn't right.
I took my family to colonial Jamestown this summer. So the period of colonization in North America, and one of the characters is dressed exactly like they were dressed in the 1600s. So yeah, it's all over the place.
Hey, listen, I have a pair of overalls that I had in high school still, so I get it. Like, I get it. Sometimes you find something that works for you and you just keep it for 20, 30 years.
It was maybe supposed to seem like, they're Vikings, they steal from people, and so their armor is just stuff that they had taken from the various cultures that they had conquered. But like I said, it's just what they really plundered was the prop closet, and they just came out with what they
could.
Yeah, with what they could.
Yeah, which is Hollywood. Like, honestly, that's one of the ones where it didn't really bug me because like that's just like, yep, they had those props that they could use. It's the same thing about how like the armors from Starship Troopers just keep getting reused in sci-fi movies now because like they showed up in Power Rangers at one point because they're just there and they look good enough for a lot of different things. Cool. Those are the ones I'm not too worried about. Sure, the metalworking thing with the sword would take forever, and or at least like several days. And also like the way that would work, it's okay. Whatever. You made a sharp little sword. Okay, cool. The horses are the wrong side. I get the joke that they're trying to make. That's not the important part here. So those anachronisms are usually the ones where I'm like, it's not a big deal. It's not, they're not trying to be the most attentive to detail. The fact that they have any attention to detail is a good thing. And otherwise they're just trying to do like, they're doing Beowulf.
So with Ibn Fadlan's selection as the 13th warrior in the film, are we really given any indication in the movie as to why it was important for him or why it was important for the 13th warrior to be someone foreign to them? Like, is there any point in which his background or the fact that he's not one of them ends up saving the day? Because I found that really unclear.
In terms, like, so there's obviously the Oracle says it's important. I took it as he's smart, and he definitely has points where he figures out things, like he figures out the cave part, for example. And I think that those are elements of like, oh, he's learned, that sort of play to it. But most of those are not really that he's educated so much as that he is inherently smart. So yeah, I think that you lose some of those because the abilities that are required of him are not the particularly ones that his background brings. They're ones that just is who he is brings
as an individual.
Okay, yeah, because I think like, you know, he uses deductive reasoning at various points, and you know, and he proves his worth that way. But I didn't know, you know, I was kind of expecting a moment in which, you know, he comes to the rescue. It's somewhat interesting that, you know, it's not him who ends up fighting the big bad at the end. You know, he doesn't come to the rescue at the very end, even though the movie's named after him. You know, it's, you know, when they do things at various points in the film to suggest that he is important, and there isn't any one moment in the film where he you know, demonstrates that, you know, if it wasn't for him, they would have completely failed.
Yeah. I mean, I think like there are just small, subtle moments where he just sees things that others don't see. He is the person that spots both children running. He does see the cave more. He's the first person to realize that they like the Wendol really are human, right? He's like, or that they're not like supernatural, that they're really something. So I guess like in subtle ways, they're telling you that like, because he's not super, like he doesn't carry the same superstitions as the group that he's with. And his faith, and not just his faith, but like his being prone to reason, right? And to looking at things with a reasonable eye makes him an asset, because he always kind of sees beyond what they see, because he doesn't necessarily believe the things that they believe, right? Like he's kind of like, what are you guys talking? No, like, you know, that doesn't sound right. You know, also he's pretty much sober most of the movie. So, I mean, he's possibly the only sober character. So maybe that's part of it. Like they were like, she was like, you need a designated driver.
Yes, that's
like, trust me, you have to have one that's no Norseman.
Yeah, I looked into that mead loophole, by the way, and it's one where like a lot of people have debated it after the fact. By people, I mean Muslim scholars or the religious leaders of Islam. And so it's one where now it doesn't cut the mustard, but actually at the time that it was technically okay because no one had really said anything because it just hadn't come up. It's the same way that coffee for a time was like being like, I don't know about that. And I think it still is for some people.
I know traditionally in the Muslim world, date palms, alcohol derived from them was a loophole. Again, I don't know if, like you said, I don't know whether it is now, but at least historically. So there are at least some substances that historically Muslims were able to at one point or another imbibe alcohol from. So I don't know the actual Islamic rule, but with the specific prohibition that he gives, that they can't drink fermented wheat or grape, suggests that it maybe is rooted in that.
Yeah, so basically it's a loophole that had not been closed yet. And so at the time, it's fine.
Yeah.
That's what we're saying. And then when he came home, everyone's like, oh, you're just drinking mead this whole time, like boozy.
Well, I mean, the implication seems to be that they would have responded with, what is this mead that you're talking about? Which I don't know if that's accurate, but it suggests that he had never actually heard of that beverage before.
I mean, to be fair, it was like he drank it on a night he thought he was going to die, and he pretty much only did it once. So, like, I feel like, you know, I think if there's any time to use a loophole.
Yeah, I was going to say, on another night, he would say, I'm going to abide by the spirit of the law rather than the letter.
Yeah.
But, you know, he was told that it wasn't grain or grape, and he was like, you know what? Okay, good, fine.
Yep. rules as written as opposed to rules as intended. We're gonna go with that.
He's kind of like facing a doomsday situation there, like I get it. We all bend the rules sometimes.
So speaking of bending the rules, we're going pretty deep on just like our conversations about this because I think there's a lot to talk about. We should get into pitches just because it's been a little bit of time. But first, we should take a break and then listen to some of the great ads for shows on our network.
Video games are a unique medium.
They can tell stories,
Immerse us in strange, fantastic worlds.
blur the very boundaries of our reality.
But at the end of the day, video games are fun, whatever fun is to you.
I'm Jeff Moonen,
And I am Matt, a.k.a. Stormageddon.
and on Fun and Games, we talk about the history, trends, and community of video games.
It's a celebration of all the games we play and all the fun we find within them.
And there's so many more games out there. So we hope you'll share in that conversation with us.
Fun and Games podcast with Matt and Jeff. Find us on certainpov.com or wherever you get your podcasts.
And happy gaming.
And we're back to continue bending, if not breaking, the rules of this movie because it's a movie. This is a weird movie to talk about here because I do like it a lot. Like the finished product, I still really adore, even if there's potentially a better version out there. Even like whether it's like the McTiernan cut or just like what we're speculating on, I do really like this movie. But I am curious where you all would fall on that spectrum. Jeremy, you are the guest. If you had to take a crack at it based on what you know and what you have thought about it and what we've talked about, you're welcome to, or one of us can go first, but you're the guest, so I give you first right of refusal.
I haven't solved this. I haven't cracked this nut, but I do have a suggestion as to a direction to go. We said earlier that Beowulf doesn't really work if it's just about the monster fights. That it has to be about something, or the monster fights need to be in the service of something else. I was saying that one of the ways to read the poem is that it's about how to be or how not to be a good king, and Beowulf's conduct during the fights demonstrates his fitness or unfitness for the role. And so, if the 13th Warrior were to do the same and make its adventure in the service of some larger idea, whether it be about how cultures can or cannot get over differences in order to work together, and what the limits to that are, or whether it be about the court intrigue that the screenplay makes feints towards that doesn't really pay off at the end. Those are ways that we could end up caring more about what happens to these characters and have more use for the fights that they get into, more than just simply, as you said, Case, it just being about, hey, we're doing something different with Beowulf.
Yeah, I think that's where I'm roughly at too. Like this movie needs to say more. I'm not sure what it needs to say, but it needs to say more.
Yeah, I mean, because like you use the example of the Alien franchise, where they have essentially the Beowulf story, but it's saying things about capitalism and feminism and other issues like that. They've taken the story of fighting a monster and they've made it about something. So I guess the question, at least from my perspective, would be, given what the elements that the movie has, what is it that they could say using the materials that they have at their disposal?
Yeah, that is definitely a thing I keep going back and forth on this movie. Like I don't have a set answer either. And I think in the normal rules of what we talk about is like, it has to be hypothetically possible. Like you can't say like, let's do a crazy reshoot that costs a ton of money. This movie already had that. Like one of the reasons why it's considered a bomb is because there are unsubstantiated rumors that the reshoots doubled the budget of this movie, which I don't think is true. I think that they're factoring in marketing budgets, which probably the rescoring also is a big part of that. But I like getting a movie up to 165 million for a budget is pretty high at this time of production. Like we're just not quite into that window, and its original budget was 75 million. So I don't think that I don't think they literally doubled the movie, like or more than doubled the movie. Like I think that's crazy. The figures where they cost us $85 million. I think that those are also folding in costs that you normally just don't discuss. But it is suffice to say that people didn't respond to this movie. It didn't do well in that regard, and is it Michael Crichton that's the issue? I don't know.
Maybe. It's possible.
Sam, what are your thoughts on this one? Because I'm not allowed to go before you.
Yeah, that's true. Usually it's very detailed. Although today maybe I should take a chance, but I won't. You're just always too detailed.
I'm not tonight. I'm going to be honest.
No, I think that generally I feel that I would love, now that I know that there was a score that had more Arab influence to it, I kind of would like to hear that and see that version of this film. Not that there's anything wrong with the score as it is, now, but I think that if we can actually make Antonio Banderas' character more the focal point, give him some more footing in the beginning, it would be really lovely just to kind of like know who he is. Also, I kind of just like want a little more like Lord of the Rings action, but like campfire Lord of the Ring action, if you know what I mean. Like, let's have the guy who's the musician like play a song or strum like while they're waiting. There's always that lovely, like, I mean, that's the best parts of the books, right? When they're bonding, waiting for doom, kind of. And so I think that would have made some of the losses mean more. Just kind of having everyone, not just during the language portion, but just a scene or two. Wouldn't even have to be large or long or anything like that. Just to give us a little more depth in the group. Other than that, I really do like this movie still. I enjoy it. And I often wonder that if some of the actual like cultural elements or like not necessarily the signature of the cultures, but had this been like a different, like an alternate planet or something like that, if some of the criticisms would have fallen to the wayside because people wouldn't be so focused on like the fact that these are like Norsemen and Arab and specific, like, and then it could just be creatures and that kind of stuff. But yeah, and I would also just make sure that someone besides Michael Crichton and someone who's very well versed in medieval Islamic culture is on set, so that didn't kind of fall apart for that character.
Yeah, I don't know if we could get away with recasting Antonio Banderas.
No, I don't. I don't think you could. But I think as like again, like I'm not recasting anyone because generally our rule is like we don't recast, right? But like having an expert on there to be like, oh, hey, Antonio, like, just so you know, like, this is something that would happen. Or no, that's not, actually, this is just to flesh out a little bit of it and maybe even make Antonio, who was not quite as comfortable, as you said in the interview, feel a little more comfortable with what he was working with. Right. Because I think like, just having Michael Crichton there to tell him what things are is not the same as having someone that actually knows that time period and the actual culture that he's representing.
Yeah, I would have been really interested in a movie that was just simply Ibn Famlin, encountering different peoples of Central Asia and, having adventures in which, his encounter with the Norsemen is just one of several very interesting episodes in his ambassadorship, but that's an entirely different movie, I think, from what
it is.
I
mean, honestly,
you can't just like reduce Beowulf to just simply one, one episode.
That was really weird how we fought a monster, its mother, and a dragon. Oh yeah. Well, moving on to the next thing.
Yeah. Well, yeah, but now, trade deals among the Volga Boatmen. It's just as gripping. Everyone loved those parts in the Star Wars prequels that were about trade deals.
Absolutely.
Right?
This is the best part.
Yeah. So looking at this and looking at what we actually got, I think that the 13th Warrior as a title was made to make it I know because I watched the interview with Crichton where he's like, yeah, I wanted it to be like more mass appeal kind of thing. And I think that it came out at the wrong time for the type of movie it was going to be. And it honestly should have not been that type of movie. Like, it came out at the end of August of 1999 and it opened second in the box office after Sixth Sense, which did not open the same weekend. It was just a juggernaut at the time and it was continuing to dominate the box office that summer. And I think it should have been held for the summer. And I think you should have played up the horror aspect. And I think that it should have just kept the name The Eaters of the Dead. and leaned into that aspect, because I think that the idea of how horrifying is the unknown is not focused on enough in this ultimately, for the lack of humanity that they're going to instill in the Wendol. Like they're too much generic bad guys as opposed to a truly alien culture. Not trying that pardon the alien reference there again. I'm sorry, but
just can't help yourself.
Well, because I think it would be nice if, you know, we have a moment where Eben tries to go and reach out to the Northmen. He's like, I'm supposed to be an ambassador. I'm supposed to talk to people. That's a good moment at the beginning of this movie. I wish he had stuff like that with the Wendol. Like, I think that would have been a good spot there. And if they spat in his face and like, you know, murdered his friend, like that would be a good way to convey that like, oh, we can't reason with them. Like it's maybe in the future, maybe if we prove ourselves and they back off, like there could be future diplomacy. But at the moment, they're focused on our death. Like have that element there, have them be really scary, make an R-rated movie from the get-go, and really play to that. Be like, hey, we're going to go for an October release. We're going to have really scary people, and like part of the conversation is going to be about how you bridge those gaps and like where it works and where it falls. And like I think maybe the Act 2 thing, like the end of Act 2 should be like they start to almost get to a point of sort of reasoning with them, like the Wendol back off, like they figure out a way to like scare them enough, and maybe it fails, and that's how like the Wendol like try again, or they breach their side of it, you know, like that's when they attack the mother. They figure out where the mother is, and like, you know, like what if Beowulf goes off without Eben, and goes and slays the mother because he thinks that'll end it, and that's what brings on the end conflict right there. Like those would be kind of cool ways to make it work, because there's this element of honor, and like where he falters, or you know, someone else, you know, if it's Wiglaf or if it's Unferth and they actually go with the name from the from the original text, like those would be spaces where you could have that sort of support this thing, as opposed to just like, we're just going to keep fighting these guys, and it's going to get better lit as we go to the end of the movie. Play that up, because we should care about our people. We should care when they die. We should feel like this party is getting smaller and smaller, and that all these people that we really cared about over the course of this movie we're losing. But as it is, we honestly don't enough. Like again, there are 2 redheads in their party.
Are there though?
I think that would have addressed some of my concerns with the way that they were depicted as well. Like if you had a point in the story in which they try to open lines of communication with them, and you see what works or does not work with them, it essentially, you know, makes it very clear. Actually, it probably would have gotten rid of the element of the story in which there's the confusion over whether they're human to begin with, essentially. You know, in general, you know, I think we're supposed to understand them as like in some way actually believing they're bears to a certain degree.
Yeah, or at the very least they've internalized it a lot.
Yeah, but they don't really act like bears very much. They wear bear skins, but like, oh yeah, they're bears. That's why they're coming at us with fire on horseback.
Right.
Like bears always do.
From the cave that they made a bridge that you cross with.
You know, and so like if they were to establish at the beginning that, you know, that no, these are humans, and that we have a very human, you know, and so if we first try to deal with them as humans, I think that would have ended up working better too.
Yeah, I mean, this you just like sparked this in me. They knew that old lady was in the woods the whole time, or at least the queen did, and she never went to her ever, like to be like, hey, like, what's up with these people? How do I fix this?
Well, like what's going on up until the point they arrive? Like they talk about how there's no fortification. Was there fortification that was destroyed? Because like it was a long journey. Like they're coming from, at the very least, Russia to Denmark by boat and horse. Like that's not like a couple days. That's like fucking months. It's long enough that he learns goddamn Old English.
Yeah, and they get there, and by the time they get there, they're like, it's just women and children. Like it's like clearly whoever was defending this has been picked off. So it's like, why didn't these people fortify? Why did they need these 13 men to come in and be like, hey, you should build a fence and a moat and shit? They were like, oh yeah.
Well, and you can explain some of it by like they had tried to fortify, but they're bad at it. And every time they try to fortify, it gets destroyed. Like that works okay for like some basis of that purpose. Like, you know, but that's a line of text, you know, that or a line of dialogue. And it's like, oh, you can see how they tried, but they're like, they did this all wrong.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
You know, they should have put a moat there and then the spikes, as opposed to they just put spikes right there. Like they're clearly just burned down.
You can even have the prince be the person who's like, well, I put spikes there. And they're like, you're a fucking idiot. And that's why he's like so angry at them for like not.
Wiglaf, you pointed them towards us, though.
Exactly. It would just be like, you know, like, you're a dunce. You know, I think that would have also given like more reason for him to then be going and just speaking into the king's ear, trying to kind of be like, oh, they're here to take over, blah, 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 blah. Because then there's resentment, right? Because it's like, oh, like they think they know everything. They don't know everything. Spikes should be pointed at you.
Right, because they leap the spikes and then you drive them into it. And that's how it works.
Right, exactly.
Am I misremembering, or do they mention at one point that there had been settlements even further north that they had lost contact with?
That sounds right. I don't remember.
Yes,
the specific line.
in fact,
Okay.
the first child that they see running is from a settlement further north.
Was it from a settlement or just a house?
And then and that's where
They say that there was a settlement off to the north and the house is there. So it's just the house that's left. But like, I'm thinking that those are just like, you know, there's always those people that just refuse to move no matter what. You know, let's just stay behind even though there's a natural disaster coming. I figured that those were those people. Like the settlement had long been abandoned.
Yeah, and I think those would all work, like to sort of justify it. Like they've been beset, they've lost contact with other buildings, and they've been terrible at actually building their defenses because Wiglaf or, you know, Unferth, whatever, is just terrible at it. But he insists that he's good.
Yeah, he insists that he's good. He insists that he's doing everything that he needs to do. And that people just need to follow the rules and follow what he says. And then you can just be like, oh, this little shit does deserve to have his friend be killed. And and like, you know, give him a little Joffrey. Give him a little, you know, mad king, mad prince energy. And then you've got something cooking, really.
Yeah, it's interesting to look at this movie in comparison with having just looked at Beowulf, where they're trying to do the beats as it was and then add this like extra layer of like thematic components that I think was a little awkward in that production. And this one, I mean, it's hard to hate a movie that's as tight as it is. It's like only an hour 40 for like a big, like lots of armies on horseback fighting kind of like there's like 4 or 5 big battles in this movie. Like that's a lot for this runtime. So it's hard to hate a movie that is that tight in that regard, but it is also still not like, it doesn't say a lot beyond being like, look how cool we are at doing Beowulf in this way. And that's the bummer that keeps coming. Like, I wish that was saying more in all of those moments.
Got lots of good speeches and lots of good swords. You're welcome. That's pretty much it.
Yeah. I don't know if like making it a full on horror movie, like an R-rated movie was going to make it a cult classic in the same way, which is kind of the problem here also. Like, again, I think that there's not a lot going on in that last duel when they, you know, attack just like without any kind of strategy and Beowulf poisoned fights the leader. Like, but it is a cool scene. Like him saying like, "Lo, there do I see my father." That whole speech is really cool. It's a good goddamn moment. Him rising up and like even the kill itself is really good. Both when he knocks him off the horse and then when he does the finishing blow, him sitting down and just like being dead with like his work done. That is a Beowulf kind of moment right there. Like I've done my labors.
That climax is beautiful. I mean, the fact that every single member that's still alive joins him in the speech at some point, you know, and you know, then they're all saying it in unison by the end, you know, and they're like, okay, this is it. We're gonna meet our maker. We're gonna do this. Like, it's coming for us. It's an amazing scene. I mean, that's probably why I like this movie.
Yeah. Not to mention the fact that Beowulf's goodest boy, his wolfhound, is with him this whole time and continues to be a badass even up until the end.
Yeah, and he's the one that like lets everyone know because he says the goodest boy that Beowulf is done and his work is done. And you just hear this little cry from the dog and everyone turns. It's like, oh, he's dead, looking all majestic and shit, like not like a real dead body because he's sitting up straight with his sword right next to him.
But it is an awkward reshoot, and like that's the problem. I don't know if we would have made a movie that I would like as much and want to talk about as much as what we ultimately got, because I don't like horror movies.
Yeah, I don't either. Anyone listening to this
actually,
podcast
me neither.
knows that. I've talked about it a lot.
So it's just a weird challenge of this film. So I don't know. I think this, it's kind of like when we talked about Buckaroo Banzai, where I'm like, I'm too close to this movie. Like that was a movie that I would have made. Like, I don't know how to make a better one. Like that's the movie I aspire to make. And this is one where I'm like, no, you know what? Because I am that history nerd that really appreciates the deconstruction of a myth and like trying to do like a realistic version. Trust me, if you ever find me drunk in a room, like I'll talk to you about my deconstruction of Hercules I want to do. Like that's like, again, it's just my type of thing. So I don't know if it would be more of a cult classic. I mean, I think it might have just been like a little bit better commercially with a better box office and with better critics, but like maybe people wouldn't talk about it in the same way if we did these changes. So it's just kind of a weird balance there, because like I like so much of this movie, but it definitely works for me because it's a short movie that I like a lot of things, and then I don't have to think too much about the things that like aren't being said.
Yeah.
Kind of to echo what you just said, I mean, I said that at least among medievalists, this movie is brought up quite often, but if it had been, a competent but not necessarily great horror movie, or a competent but not necessarily great historical drama, or any of the other, things that it could have been, I'm not sure that it would have been talked about as much as it actually ends up being talked about, at least in certain circles.
Yeah, it's a tough balance. Beowulf is really hard to do, y'all, especially all as one movie. Like that. Yes. Like we talked about both Predator and Alien having elements of the Grendel element to it. And, Alien then gets the benefit of the trilogy kind of having those components. Like Aliens, they fight the mother, and Alien 3, they call it the dragon. Like those are still separate movies. And like you can have stakes and twists and so forth in there. Like, having so many big encounters means that it is difficult to add nuance to the individual encounters.
Yeah, that's true. And, and there's things about the poem that are just uncinematic. I mean, the fact that it jumps 50 years at one point in it, which is an awkward thing to do in a movie, the fact that it keeps referring to this North European history that the original audience would have known, but is completely mysterious to us. These aren't things that are going to translate to cinema.
So this is a tough one for us to talk about, but I'm really glad that we did talk about it. Jeremy, thank you for coming on and chatting with us about it.
Thank you so much for having me. Yes, it's great to catch up.
Yeah, man, I'm so glad to talk. Hopefully we can talk again soon, either off mic or would love to have you back on at some point if you've got anything.
Absolutely.
Especially if you have a movie where you're like, this is a really good version of it.
Oh, I was gonna say if you ever do Kingdom of Heaven, I'm definitely on board.
Oh my God, we have to at some point, because the director's cut versus the original, like the theatrical cut, are so different.
Oh yeah, absolutely.
We might have to book you down for that one. Just now. You heard it here, listeners.
Yeah.
Case just got so excited. And listeners, I am afraid. No,
Sam, you don't understand. When I came back from seeing that in theaters with a bunch of my friends, we're like, okay, so we're all just going to pretend that we didn't see that movie because we're embarrassed that we saw it. And then we saw the director's cut later and we're like, what the fuck happened?
Yeah, absolutely. It's one of those, absolutely. Where we've been talking about McTiernan and what his vision might have been. Ridley Scott, when he was finally able to share what the movie was supposed to be, people were like, oh my goodness, it's actually a good movie.
Yeah, so it might be the shortest episode we ever do, where it's just like, well, here's all the problems with the theatrical cut. What's your pitch? Do the director's cut. Oh, there we go.
Let Ridley Scott do what he wanted to do in the first place.
Yeah. But as for today, Jeremy, if people wanted to find you, follow you, or just check out stuff you've worked on, whatever, give your plugs, talk about yourself.
Yeah, I'm not extremely online, so I don't really have much to have to share for people to follow me. I did publish a book a few years ago. Ready for a very long academic title, but it's called Outlawry, Liminality, and Sanctity, and it's about outlaw traditions in the literature of the North Atlantic. It's an academic book, so you should not buy it yourself. It means it's very expensive, but you should tell your library to buy it. And so it's out of Amsterdam University Press, if anyone's interested.
All right. So anyone who is interested should reach out to your local library and see if they can get it, because libraries are good.
Yes, we love libraries.
But if that's what you got, they should go check that out. Sam, where can people find and follow you?
They can find me here, and they can talk to me on our Discord, and they can't find me anywhere else because I don't exist in real life. I'm just a figment of Case's imagination. And, he's just really good at throwing his voice.
Well, it's wonderful what we can do in post. But after this podcast, so in post, you should go check out certainpov.com, where you can find more episodes of this show. You can find other awesome podcasts, like, say, for example, Fun and Games with Matt and Jeff. Matt, our editor, and Jeff Moonen, one of my dear friends, are just wonderful people who think deeply about the culture and creative process of video games, and have done a great job of cultivating a positive space where they can talk about developments in video games. They get to interview creators and really, really get into the creative aspect of video games. And then to further that positivity, they do Side Quest, which is a series where people contribute 5 to 15 minutes where they just ramble about why they like a game. And that positivity is really infectious. And I have been very happy to see both of those projects develop. They're all in one feed. And if you like SideQuest, I actually am the editor for the video versions of that we have on our YouTube channel. So, check out our YouTube channel. I do animated ones for it. Like those are fun. But then after that, you can find me on Twitter at Case Aiken. You can find the podcast on Twitter at Another Pass. I think that wraps it up. We've been talking about this for a while, so I'm a little burned out. Sam, what is coming up next?
Next time on Another Pass, we'll be talking about Highlander 2: The Quickening. But until then, if you enjoyed this, pass it on.
Thanks for listening to Certain Point of View's Another Pass podcast. Don't miss an episode. Just subscribe and review the show on iTunes. Just go to certainpov.com.
Another Pass is a Certain POV production. Our hosts are Sam Alicea and Case Aiken. The show is edited by Matt Storm. Our logo and episode art is by Case Aiken. Our intro theme is by Vin Macri, and our outro theme is by Matt Brogan.
I was just talking up your improv skills to Sam.
He was. And he was like, he's really responsible. I was like, I'm sure, like, this happens.
Yeah,
like,
sure he did. Sure he is, yeah.
No, Case was like, no, I swear, he's a very responsible person.
He's a professor. They're not absent-minded.
And I was like, well, he's got kids now. Kids melt brains.
CPOV. CertainPOV.com.